Capernaum up here. And Jesus spends a lot of time up in Capernaum. In fact, we need to note that most of the teaching of Jesus and most of the miracles recorded in the Gospels take place in Galilee. Most of the teaching and most of the miracles in the Gospels take place in Galilee. And so there he goes to up to Capernaum. And in Capernaum, there's well, that's the first place it's recorded that Jesus casts out a demon. And so he demonstrates his power over Satan at his first trip to Capernaum. Okay. And then we have an early Judean ministry in AD 27. It's about 8 months long. And he goes down to Jerusalem. And it's at this point that Jesus has the first cleansing of the temple. His first cleansing of the temple. And that's recorded in John chapter 2, by the way. When he does so, he says this, "It is written, my house is to be a house of prayer, but you have made it a house of merchandise, a place of commerce. He will cleanse the temple again at the end of his ministry, and at that time he will say, it is written, my house is to be a house of prayer, but you have made it what? A den of thieves." They've gone downhill, haven't they? Okay, so, but here is the first cleansing of the temple, and it would be in his first early Judean ministry, and so that would be in Jerusalem. And also in the first Judean ministry, he meets Nicodemus. What chapter of John that comes after 2 would you find Nicodemus? 3, okay, in John 3. And had it not been for that particular meeting, you wouldn't have John 3:16. And so we're in the early Judean ministry of Jesus, and we have a meeting with Nicodemus. And we also have the first cleansing of the temple. And then Jesus leaves there and goes over to the Jordan River. And that's when Jesus begins to baptize followers. And that's also when Jesus speaks high words about John, and John speaks high words about Jesus. That's in the early Judean ministry. Jesus leaves Judea and he goes up to Samaria. Now I just want to put this back up here. This is the Samaritan area, and Jesus said in John chapter 4, I need to go through Samaria. Why would Jesus say that? Because the Jews often had no dealings with the Samaritans, and instead of going up through there, they would skirt Samaria. If they wanted to go up to Galilee, they would skirt the area of Samaria and go on up. They usually didn't travel. But Jesus picked a route. The dotted line here shows travel routes. And he came up to the city of Sychar, and he sat down by the well that Jacob had dug. Sent the disciples on into the city to buy food. What was he waiting for? A woman. He waited for the woman to come out and draw water. And when she did, you remember the story. Okay. And basically what Jesus said to her is, you cannot put a man, a human relationship, in the place of God. That there is a place in the heart of a person for a relationship with God. And if you want your thirst to be quenched, 5 husbands won't do it, 6 won't do it. You need to put Jesus first in your life and worship Him in spirit and in truth, because the primary relationship of human experience is your relationship with Jesus Christ, and every other relationship finds its meaning and its fulfillment only when you have the primary relationship with God in place. And here was a woman who thought, I just need to find the right guy. And what she really needed was to find the right God. And so Jesus says to her, the Father is seeking people to worship Him in spirit and in truth. An honest, open, truthful, respectful relationship with God. That's what He's looking for. And woman, that's what you need. Now, His ministry in Samaria was expanded because all of the people from Sychar came out, and He stayed many days there and ministered to them. So that was His ministry in Samaria, and so we moved from there. So we've been in an early Judean ministry, we go to a Samaritan ministry, and from there we go to a Galilean ministry. And Jesus spent, as I said, more time in Galilee, and more miracles and teaching are from there. And so the Galilean ministry comes to us in different parts. And the first part of the Galilean ministry is going to take us from this return up to Galilee until the choosing of the 12. It's about 5 months of time from 27 and includes part of AD 28. Beginnings of that are that He arrives there in Galilee, and He begins by healing a nobleman's son at Cana. And then He goes back to Nazareth, and He goes in the temple, and He begins to read the Scripture that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, He has anointed me, and He says, I'm going to do this and this and this and this. And He closed it and He said, this day the Scripture is fulfilled. And what was their response to Him? In fact, after some dialogue, they wanted to stone Him. Isn't this Joseph the carpenter's son? We know you. Jesus said this, a prophet is not without honor except where? In his own country. In this case, his own city. And so he was not accepted there. In J. Dwight Pentecost story, his unfolding, his outline, he points out to us that every place that Jesus went, He eventually was rejected as the king. So that eventually it can be said that all of Judea and Galilee, even Perea, have rejected Him. All right, so there He is in the early part of this. And then He moves from there to Capernaum. And then Jesus has His first preaching tour. And the first thing He does in the first preaching tour, they get out, the disciples are fishing, and do you have any fish? No, throw your nets on the other side, and you'll catch fish. And so they do. And after that, Jesus calls 4 disciples to full-time service and says, leave your nets, and you come and follow me, and I'm going to show you how to be fishers of men. What an introduction He gave to them. So in His first preaching tour, the first thing He is doing is He's calling the first 4 disciples, not the first 4, but He's calling 4 disciples into ministry. Then immediately after that, He cleanses a person of an unclean spirit. Then He goes to Peter's home, and it looks like Jesus stays at the home of Peter in Capernaum. It looks like that becomes kind of a home base for Jesus' ministry. And you'll notice as you go through that Jesus keeps coming back to Capernaum and apparently stays at the home of Peter. Well, Peter's mother-in-law is sick and she's about to die. And so Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. No mother-in-law jokes are appropriate. And then Jesus begins to take His disciples, and they go throughout the land, and there's a cleansing of the lepers. And then, in this first preaching tour, we begin to get the opposition from the Pharisees. Now remember, He's up in the Galilee area, and so there is a man who is paralyzed. He is a paralytic, and Jesus heals him. And He heals him on a Sabbath day. And so we immediately get all kinds of opposition from the religious leaders. Jesus calls Matthew, and he says, I want you to follow me. And Matthew leaves his occupation. What was his occupation? IRS. No, not IRS. But he was a tax collector. All right, and from there, Matthew says, you know what, Jesus, I'd like to call in my friends. And so Matthew has a whole bunch of his fellow tax collectors. They don't have too many friends outside of their own circle. But because his life has been changed, he says, if I have a group of my tax collector friends come, would you show up? And Jesus does. And he begins to preach and minister to them. And so Matthew is no sooner a follower of Jesus than he becomes Matthew the evangelist, and he wants to bring people to Jesus. I wonder what it was like to be brought to Jesus. Have you ever wondered what meeting Jesus was like? It had to be a very unique experience, especially if you were seeking to know God. He's a man like none other. And Matthew wanted others to know that as well. And so Jesus heals a man on a Sabbath day then. And then there's a controversy about walking through the field or plucking grain on the Sabbath day, because the Pharisees thought that if you walk through and you know, your clothes might rub up against some of the grain and thrash it, so you shouldn't ever walk through the field, because that would be work because you're thrashing the grain. They had all kinds of silly things that they said like that, but they began to question him about Sabbath laws and so on like that. Not laws from the Bible, but laws that they had made up about the Sabbath. So Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath, and there's a controversy that follows that. And then we enter a second period, and in Jesus' second period of time, he goes out and he prays, and then he chooses the 12 in his second period. And then he withdraws. From there he will withdraw to the northern part of Galilee.